Good evening, and thank you for joining us in this format. My name is Lieutenant Mike McGee. I'm the pastor or the officer at the Salvation Army Church in Burlington, North Carolina. And we'd invite you, if you ever get the chance or if you're ever through our way, to stop by and see us sometime. We've been working through a study this summer called How We Got Our Bible, and it's based on a book by Earle. And so we've kind of been walking through that and talking about it. And we've hit a big task here as we're in, I think, week 4 of this study. We started looking at kind of the inspiration and where we get the idea that the Bible is inspired, that it comes from God, where that idea originates. What we're talking about now is the literal books of the Bible, where they came from in terms of who wrote them, who they wrote them to, and why they wrote them. And then, so we want to keep looking at that this week, and then we hope after that to start looking at the idea of canonization, why we chose to include certain things in the Bible and why other things were not included. And so that's where we're moving and where we're headed. I want to get straight into it this week because we have a lot to cover as we are endeavoring to look at every book of the Bible and just have the briefest conversation about it to say who wrote it and why they wrote it and maybe who were they writing to as they wrote that book. And so we're just doing a very quick overview of every book in the Bible. And if you watched last week, we talked about every book from the law, from the historical books in the Old Testament. And so this week we're picking up with poetry and wisdom literature. And we're hoping to finish out the Old Testament this week so we can talk about the New Testament next week. When we talk about poetry and wisdom literature, we're talking about a handful of books there. But these books are fascinating to me because for some people, historical books are going to speak to them. They like stories. They like things where you can trace this family and that family, and you can see some intrigue and things in there. But for some people, these books of poetry and wisdom, this is what's going to speak to our hearts. This is where we see in the Bible people that look like us. This is where we realize that though our circumstances are really different, we see people who, from the perspective of the heart, are going through and dealing with some of the same things we deal with. And they celebrate and they cry and they have hardship and they have victory. And we see all these things, these emotions poured out for us in the poetry and wisdom books. And so the first one we want to look at is Job. We think Job is maybe the oldest book in the Bible. And by that, what we mean is the one that was written first. And so we don't know who wrote it, but we know it is a very old book. It was written a long, long time ago. And Job tells the story, and possibly you're already familiar with Job, so maybe you don't need this lesson, but Job tells the story of how one man who lived a righteous life loses everything. As Satan comes and makes a deal with God, he says, hey, God says, look at my servant Job. He does everything the right way. Satan says, well, that's only because you give him everything. And so let me take everything away from him and we'll see if he's just then. And so Satan takes everything away from Job, and we see Job suffer immensely. And then we see his friends show up, and his friends give him some bad advice. And that's what we see happen in the book of Job. And Job helps us understand suffering. But more importantly, I think Job helps us understand faith. As Job says, though he slays me, still I trust him. And so Job, a lot of times, kind of our modern mind likes to think about Job in terms of, well, we're putting God on trial so that God can answer our questions about why suffering and why this and that. And that's not really what Job is about. Job is a book that's about Job being put on trial, Job's faith being put on trial, and how much does he really trust in God. And we see that Job demonstrates great faith through the book. And so as much as it's a book about incredible suffering, it's also a book about incredible faith. And I think it's something that's helpful to us when we go through hard times, to remember that we're not the first person in history to go through hard times. but really that the oldest book we have tells the story of someone who went through really hard times. And so it's a helpful thing for us. Psalms is kind of this longest book, and Psalms are the songs of the Jewish people. These are the songs they sing, and they have different purposes. 150 of them were written by David. A bunch of the others, we have a few that we know, like, oh, Moses wrote this one maybe. We have a lot that have anonymous authors. But overall, the Psalms represent the songs of the Jewish people. And Psalms, again, it's a book that can speak to us in unique ways, because in the Psalms, we see human emotions poured out. And so we see people celebrate. We see people win big victories, and they say, I just want to sing out to God about the thing he has done. We see people singing songs that kind of, hey, it's that time of year again. As we go up to Jerusalem again, we're going to sing this Psalm of Ascension that we sing with this particular festival or celebration. And then we see people sing songs that are laments. They sing songs where they cry out to God and say, God, why are things happening this way? God, why do you allow my enemies to do these things? When will you step up and act on my behalf? And so we find as we read through the Psalms, and it can be a challenging thing to say, I'm going to sit here and read all the way through the Psalms, but as you sit and pick a psalm and read it and meditate on it, we find that we see human emotion poured out to God. And when we come up short on words to express what we're feeling, we can find our feelings expressed there in the Psalms. And so that's a beautiful book. Proverbs is largely a collection of Solomon's wisdom. We know that Solomon was the wisest man to ever live. And so he was considered very wise in his day. And as he shared his wisdom, the book of Proverbs is largely a collection of that wisdom. The book that follows, we also think is probably written by Solomon. The guy that writes it is named as the son of David. And as Solomon writes here, it's an interesting partner to Proverbs, where in Proverbs, Solomon says, here's all my wisdom. We get to Ecclesiastes, and Solomon says, all wisdom is useless. And Ecclesiastes really, we see the first existentialist. And in Solomon, we see a guy who has had everything. He's gotten everything. He's king of Judah during one of its most prominent times. And he's built incredible wealth. He's built this incredible temple. He lives in an incredible palace. And yet, as he nears the end of his life, we read Ecclesiastes where he starts saying, well, a lot of this seems meaningless. It turns out the only thing where any of us should find meaning is in God. And that's what we see in Ecclesiastes. And so really, Solomon is the first existentialist, as he has a breakdown in Ecclesiastes. But there's a beautiful thing there for us as we live in a culture that says, hey, just get as much stuff as we can. We see Solomon, the guy who wrote the book of wisdom called Proverbs, say to us, hey, accumulating all that stuff, it's meaningless. The only thing we do that matters is what we do for God. And Solomon shares that with us there. In Song of Songs, this is the final book attributed to Solomon, and it describes romantic love. It's the one that maybe you want to send the kids to bed before you read it. And some say that in Solomon, as we see this relationship described, that it can represent Christ's relationship to the church. And so you can look at it in kind of that allegorical way if you choose. But it is kind of the final piece we have from Solomon. That takes us through, that's what we call kind of the poetry and wisdom literature. And the next thing we want to look at are the major prophets. And we're going to look at the major prophets and then go straight into the minor prophets. And the major prophets are really all the prophets. What a prophet is someone that speaks for God. Someone that shows up and says, hey, this is what God says. And what we see in kind of a biblical context is a lot of times they show up and says, say, God says do this, and if you don't do this, then this is what the outcome is going to be. This is what the consequence is going to be for disobeying God. And so that's what the prophets do for the most part in our biblical context. An important thing to note is that we wouldn't say that the prophets we have in the Bible are the only prophets, but we would say that they're the written prophets. These are the guys that came along at a point in Israel's history and started writing things down as they gave their prophecy. And so we might, for example, say that Moses was a prophet, or that Miriam was a prophet, or we might look at different people and say that they were prophets, but these are the guys that wrote things down during a pivotal time in Israel's history that's really going to span much of Kings, and then into the exile, and then even some into the return to Jerusalem in Israel's history. Isaiah is the first major prophet. He was a prophet to Judah. That was the southern kingdom, and he served near the end of kind of the kingdom of Judah, just before Babylonian captivity. And many scriptures we read in Isaiah are going to point us toward the coming Christ in the New Testament. And the New Testament writers are going to borrow a lot from Isaiah to say, hey, look, for unto us a child is born, a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father. And so the New Testament authors are going to look back a lot at Isaiah and pull from his writings to say, see how all of our old writings, all of our Old Testament writings, the prophets and the law, see how they point toward the coming of Christ. Hosea is a prophet to Israel and the northern kingdom, and his wife is a lady named Gomer, and Gomer prostituted herself. She cheated on Hosea over and over and over. She was an unfaithful wife, and Hosea's job as a prophet, some prophets, their job was to go and say to people, hey, do this or live this way. But some people's job, as they prophesied, was to live out a prophetic life. And so Hosea's job was to go again and again and show us how God treats us. That as we are unfaithful to God again and again and again, God comes and brings us back again and again and again. And so Gomer is unfaithful to Hosea, and he brings her back and takes her back in as his wife. And so he really is trying to show this northern kingdom of Israel by the way that he lives. He's trying to show them how they treat God when they go off and worship God and worship other gods and do other things. He says that their behavior, they are prostituting themselves to other gods. Let's move on from Hosea. Amos is possibly the earliest written prophet, the earliest guy to say, I'm saying these things, but I want to write them down so that you have them. He emphasizes social justice in Israel, especially at Bethel. Joel prophesies to Judah, the southern kingdom, and he talks about a plague of locusts, and that plague of locusts represents the coming punishment for Judah. That moves into the section we call the minor prophets, and Obadiah is here. And Obadiah is a one-chapter book, and it has one theme: the destruction of Edom, another nation, followed by the restoration of Israel. And so Obadiah is a short book. We talk about destruction of Edom and the restoration of Israel. Jonah, which is one that a lot of us are familiar with from stories or from VeggieTale movies. But Jonah tells the story of folly and of racial pride. As God says, go to Nineveh and ask those people to repent. And Jonah refuses to go, but eventually he does go, and the people there do repent. And so it also shows us God's love for all mankind. And so as the people of Israel were inclined at that point in their history to believe that God's love was just for them, this interjection of the story of Jonah shows us that God's love is for everybody. Even in the Old Testament, it's demonstrated. Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah and Jeremiah are all contemporaries. They're all written around the same time. They all probably lived around the same time. And so Nahum predicts punishment for the city of Nineveh. Habakkuk predicts punishment for Judah. So Nineveh are outsiders. Their people came in, messed with the people of Israel. So Nahum predicts punishment for the Assyrians in Nineveh. Habakkuk predicts punishment for Judah. If you don't straighten up, the same thing that happened to that northern kingdom is going to happen to you. Zephaniah speaks against idolatry in Judah. He says, hey, quit worshiping other gods and worship only the one true God. And Jeremiah, who's one of the three longest prophets, warns of impending doom. And he is the weeping prophet, which we get, I think, from Jeremiah chapter 9. But he says, hey, if we don't straighten up, we're going to be carried off. And it's going to be destruction for Jerusalem and for the kingdom of Judah. That destruction comes to pass as the Babylonians come and carry Judah off into exile in Babylon. And so the next book we believe is also written by Jeremiah, and it is called Lamentations. And in Lamentations, Jeremiah laments the destruction of Jerusalem. The fascinating thing is from Jeremiah, we get this famous verse, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. And the fascinating thing is Jeremiah says this before the exile. As he's predicting the exile, he says, God has a plan for us. And so it's good to remember when we remember that verse, and a lot of people take that verse in terms of, oh, God's going to do great things for me. It's important to remember that Jeremiah says before they go into exile, before he writes his Lamentations, he says God knows the plans he has for us. And so eventually the people of Israel are faithful and are able to be brought out of exile. Ezekiel prophesies from captivity in Babylon and describes a future ideal Israel. Daniel writes from captivity. Daniel, the first half is kind of the history of Daniel, the story of his life and his faith in captivity. And then the second half of Daniel shares these visions that you kind of have to do some work to try and understand. We move then to Haggai and Zechariah. Those two, again, were contemporaries. They wrote around the same time. They started writing in the same year. And Haggai writes specifically, kind of think contemporary to Ezra, who we talked about last week. He starts writing about the responsibility we have to rebuild the temple. And then Zechariah writes about righteousness over ritualism. Zechariah says we should seek doing the right thing and being the people God wants us to be over just doing the right list of commands. And then Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, and it looks forward to the coming Messiah. And for Christian believers, we look at the book of Malachi and we say, hey, here's the last word before 400 years of silence leading into the coming of Christ in the book of Matthew. So that takes us through the whole Old Testament. It was a lot. We went really fast through it. But what I want to encourage you to do or think about is think about some of the books we talked about today, or maybe the books we talked about last week, and think about something that stuck out in your mind, something that you think maybe God is calling you to think about or consider a little more. And I'd like you to take time this week to consider reading some of that book and seeing what God says there and seeing how he can speak to you through that. I thank you for being with us. This has been week 4 of How We Got Our Bible, and we look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday. God bless.